everyone is suddenly going silent in sports media. Almost no one is weighing in saying, oh my goodness, let's talk about gun control. Let's talk about getting guns off the streets. It's just silence because the individuals that have been charged now, 2 juveniles and 2 adults, all of whom, to my knowledge, by the way, are black, is an uncomfortable conversation that the sports media doesn't want to have. And so let's have that uncomfortable conversation. Because we were talking about this some on Clay and Buck, but I think it's important in the wake of the Super Bowl shooting, over 20 people shot, a mother murdered in cold blood, totally innocent, happens to get shot by one of these ricocheting bullets that were being fired in every direction, many kids hit. Let's have a conversation about why this happens and who actually commits gun violence. I even saw in the New York Times they had a story about this, quoting one of the residents of Kansas City who said what I told you, that if this shooting had happened anywhere other than the Super Bowl victory parade, nobody would have ever talked about it. Kansas City set in 2023 an all-time high for murders. Most of you probably didn't know that unless you live in Kansas City or that area. It has never been more violent or dangerous to be in Kansas City in the modern history of that city. How does this happen? How do we get to a situation where only conversations occur when identity politics makes it a comfortable conversation for many people on the left and sometimes for people on the right as well? Look, I used to make a big point of this on OutKick programs. I'm anti-death. I want there to be fewer people who die out there in America. I want your grandma to live forever. I want your sons and daughters to grow up healthy. I want there to be less violence, whether it's using guns or other objects in this country. And I had this conversation back in the day a lot on OutKick, and it made people uncomfortable. When Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the NFL games and said he was protesting police violence against blacks, I said, okay, let's go into the numbers. 75% of people that are shot and killed by police on average every year are actually white, Hispanic, or Asian. That is, they aren't black. Only 25% of police shooting victims are black. And yesterday, we had a big discussion on Clay and Buck about a man named Roland Fryer, who actually did research at Harvard and found that police officers were less likely to shoot black criminals than they were criminals of other races. And he surmised that police officers were aware that they were going to be judged more harshly if they shot someone who was black, and so they were less likely to engage in violence against black people. But I said, even from the moment Colin Kaepernick took his first knee, I said, if we want to have an honest conversation about violence, first of all, I don't think it's smart to do it in uniform at work, whether you work at McDonald's or Walmart or Buc-ee's or the San Francisco 49ers. During the national anthem is not the time to have a conversation, in my opinion, about any issue that you want really talked about, because the protest during the anthem takes away from the conversation. But I said, why is Colin Kaepernick not taking a conversation about police violence if he wants to have that conversation? But even if you eliminated every person shot and killed by police every year, 98% of shooting deaths would still be occurring. It's important. Why? I said this, and some people got mad at me, go figure. I said this would be like a fat person saying, my hand is too fat. The issue isn't that your hand's fat. The issue is that you are fat in your whole body. And if you want to lose weight, you can't say, man, my thumb is really fat. I got to solve this thumb and then everything will be right. No. If we want to address issues of violence in this country and of murder, then we have to look at the overall data and we have to say, who commits murders? How do we dial it back? And a lot of people won't have a conversation because they don't want to have that conversation The overall murder rate in America is overwhelmingly being committed by young black men, the same young black men that are involved in the shooting at the Kansas City parade. And rather than shine a light on that and say, wait a minute, young black men are around 3 or 4% of the overall United States population, and they commit over half of all murders. If we want to address murders, young black men represent statistically an overwhelming percentage of the violence that occurs in this country. And by the way, most of their victims tend to be other young black men. And people know this. The data is out there. It's been out there for decades. The conversation doesn't happen because it requires an analysis of personal responsibility and how all of this is occurring. And I've got a thesis. I've got a thesis that violence in this country is overwhelmingly a failure of fatherhood. And this is also an uncomfortable conversation because it requires a lot of people to examine their own behavior and their own life choices. I think about this a lot more now because I have 3 boys. And whatever you think of me, I would be a failure as a father, in my opinion, if one of my kids ends up with a gun and engages in a violent act that takes someone else's life, or God forbid their life is also lost because of a violent act that they're involved in. I'm not talking about being an innocent victim. I'm talking about being involved in a violent act. 16-year-old, 13-year-old, and a 9-year-old. In fact, my 9-year-old is home right now, homesick from school, so I've been doing the show and running around trying to take care of him, all right? 10th grader, 7th grader, 3rd grader. I got 3 boys. I hope that all 3 of those boys grow up, become dads, have lots of kids, and are productive members of society. I'm here, about to be married 20 years, not claiming to be anywhere near a perfect dad, but I try to be better than I am, right? That should be the goal, I think, of life in general, be better than you are. I'm fortunate. My dad was fantastic. My parents have been married almost 55 years. I have a sister. My dad and mom were very good parents. I hope that I am being a pretty good parent, okay? And I'm not setting the bar incredibly high. I'm just saying if your son, it's usually sons, if your son is involved in violent behavior with a gun, you have failed as a parent on some level. And you go and look at the data and you say, okay, who are these kids? White, black, Asian, Hispanic. Who are these young boys, these young men that engage in violent acts with guns? Do you know what the data reflects? A huge percentage chance is that they're from single-parent homes. And now, look, I'm not trying to take a shot at people who are single parents. I know a ton of fabulous single parents. I can only imagine how challenging it is to raise kids as a single mom trying to be the role of both mom and dad, or a single dad trying to be both mom and dad. And some of you are going to do such an incredible job that you're going to beat the odds. Your kids are going to grow up, be wildly successful, incredibly productive, and break the single parent cycle. They're going to get married, and they're going to have kids, and they're going to be incredible dads and moms, okay? But you know what nobody will talk about? Government has created much of our fatherhood crisis. I believe the Great Society, Lyndon Baines Johnson, the idea that we're going to try to help poor people has actually created more fatherless homes. Let me give you a stat here. I was looking this up during the radio show this morning. Did you know that in 1965, 76% of all black children were born in 2-parent households? 76%. Over 3 out of 4 of kids were born with a black mom and a black dad at home. 1965. Not that long ago. By today, over 70% of all black kids are born in single-parent households. This is one of the biggest stories, I think, in America today that no one talks about. How did we go from 1965, over 100 years after the end of slavery, where 76% of black kids were born in households with moms and dads, to by today, where over 70% of all kids are born outside of a marital home? Now, the argument that they try to make on the left is, well, this is a legacy of racism. This is a legacy of slavery. If that were true, why has the black family collapsed since 1965? And by the way, the black family has collapsed more than anyone, but white families, Asian families, Hispanic families, the family unit itself has fallen into disrepair. If this were a legacy of awful systemic racism and white supremacy and all the arguments that the left wants to make, why did it not exist in 1965? Why did the collapse of the black family coincide with the rise of the Great Society and government deciding that it needed to be the father figure, not the father figure himself? And I would submit to you, and this is something I spend a lot of time thinking about, that men in this country have slowly entered into a crisis that nobody addresses. How often do you hear about unequal wage? How often do you hear that women only get paid whatever it is, 86 cents for a dollar that every man makes? And then you go look at the data and you're like, yeah, because women have kids and they leave society, and that women and men are actually paid the exact same almost in every job in America, but that men just end up working more years. Never hear that conversation. You know, men live 4 years less than women. You know, women get 60% of all college degrees right now. You know that women get the majority of advanced degrees. I mean, heck, I was a little bit ahead of the curve. I married my wife who went to law school. But you know, Vanderbilt Law School has more female lawyers graduating every year, including in my class, than they do men. What's going on that men are falling behind and not living up to their roles as the heads of households and as father figures? And by the way, I'm not saying that every man has to make more money than every woman. There are a lot of households out there where the woman may be a doctor and the man may be, maybe he's a teacher, right? And the woman makes way more money than the man, and it might make more sense for the woman from a salary perspective to be the full-time worker, and maybe the man does some of the Mr. Mom roles, right? Or vice versa. I don't really care how the structure exists. I can just tell you that we have destroyed the nuclear family. And I want you to think about this when you think about that shooting that happened at the Kansas City Super Bowl parade. What is going on that mass shootings have become so much more common? Prior to Columbine, in the 1980s and the 1990s, there weren't people showing up, by and large, very often. I know that there's exceptions, University of Texas shooting. It didn't occur, these mass shootings. I would submit to you that this is a symptom of the illness that has taken over the American family, and that the results are kids, young boys, growing up not knowing how to be men. They have lots of testosterone. They have lots of anger and violence in them, and there isn't a father figure to help to corral that. And building on this further, everybody wants to talk about how much they want to use their platform to make the world a better place, right? It's a big conversation now. I'm going to use my platform. Lots of athletes out there, lots of sports media. Certainly I think about this. I've got a big platform now. My family's taken care of. How many athletes do you see on a regular basis saying that the best thing a young boy could become is a dad and a husband and a raiser of children? Can you name a current athlete that is publicly advocating for men to be great fathers, get married, have kids, and raise those kids. I've heard Tony Dungy talk about it to his credit, and amazingly, he gets ripped for talking about it. I can't even name a current pro athlete. I know there are some that are retired. Imagine if instead of saying that America is an awful racist place, if LeBron James had come out and said, hey, every young kid that looks up to me, I'm a great athlete, but the most important job I have is being a dad. Get married, have kids, and take care of your family. That's the best thing that you could do. And it brings it home. The first place I read this was actually in the New York Times. The place that I read this was, and now I can't not see it everywhere I look, much of American life is artificial now. You have a ton of people on the left, that is, people who consider themselves to be progressive Democrats, who talk left and live right. And I can't unsee it now. All of these elite people, multimillionaires, people who are highly educated, professors, they get married and they have nuclear families, and they raise their children in two-parent households. LeBron James does this. But they talk left instead of telling people to try to emulate the lifestyle choices that they have made. Why is that? And why is it considered remotely controversial for men to be calling out men? Women are doing fine. They're graduating. They're getting advanced degrees. Their incomes are surging. Men are falling behind. In fact, there's not enough men in this country to marry all the successful women. The data reflects that women want to find a man, even if they're doctors, even if they're lawyers, even if they're PhDs, they want to find a man of equal educational or higher educational and career achievement than them. This makes sense biologically if you think about it, right? People say, oh, why are all these young women, why do they end up with older men? Because biologically, the more resources a family has, the better the chances are of kids, offspring, growing up, flourishing, and becoming successful themselves. So, look, it makes sense for a 25-year-old woman to sometimes chase after a 45 or 50-year-old man, 40-year-old man. That guy's got resources. You think it's a coincidence that men can have children for their whole lives and women can't? Again, biology is real, despite what you might be told to the contrary. Think about why this is. And think about how we're failing. And again, I would love to hear an explanation for why, as the government has poured money into the family structure and fathers have been replaced, how single-parent households have skyrocketed. And the data reflects that young boys in single-parent households raised by mothers are far less successful than when they are raised than young girls are. So, again, I think masculinity is in a crisis right now. I think the Kansas City Super Bowl shooting reflects that. Why is no one having conversation like I'm just having with you right now? Not trying to demonize anybody, not trying to say that any one thing is responsible for any one result. The conversation is about guns, not the culture that creates the violence. If we really want to solve the culture that creates the violence, isn't that what creates the shootings? There have been guns in this country our entire existence. The Second Amendment is not going away. Why have random acts of violence skyrocketed? Why are cities setting all-time highs for murder? These are conversations that a real serious constitutional republic would have every day. Instead, we don't. And I'd encourage you, we'll clip this, we'll share. I'd encourage you to share it with some of your friends, particularly if you're a dad out there, granddad, you're a single guy and you're trying to figure out what your role in society is. These are conversations that men should be having. Our role as fathers has collapsed in society. And it is, I believe, super significant in terms of the results. Here's data, by the way. This is from Adam. This is from the National Fatherhood Initiative. Research shows when a child is raised without a dad in the home, they're affected in the following ways. Greater risk of poverty, more likely to have behavioral problems, greater risk of infant mortality, more likely to go to prison, more likely to commit a crime, more likely to become pregnant as a teenager, more likely to face abuse and neglect, more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, more likely to be obese, more likely to drop out of school, and right now 17.8 million children, nearly 1 in 4 kids, doesn't have a biological step or adoptive father at home. That's according to the National Fatherhood Initiative. That's a crisis. And a crisis creates costs. And so I would ask everybody involved in sports media that wanted to tweet about the shooting that happened in the Super Bowl parade in Kansas City, why did you go quiet? Why are you not actually having conversations about real issues that matter, that impact things far beyond sports? So that's my reaction to what happened in the Kansas City parade shooting. Again, I think I mentioned this off the top. The gun was stolen. So this idea, oh, guns are the problem. No. This is about something much more than guns. This is about the crisis of masculinity and fatherhood and the creation of kids who grow up to be the kinds of individuals who are willing to fire guns in crowded areas filled with young kids. My position on this is pretty clear, and I want everybody to listen. The story here, to a large extent, vanished as soon as it became clear that this was not a mass shooting targeting random people, that it was a dispute. When juveniles have guns, a bevy of gun laws are being violated. Kansas City just set in 2023 an all-time record for murders in that city. They have a major issue with violent crime. The reality is this: when juveniles have guns and they engage in violent behavior with those guns, I think often the parents and guardians should be charged as well as the juveniles. Some of you out there are going to disagree. I've got 3 boys, 16, 13, and 9. If one of my boys, when they are a juvenile, takes a gun somewhere and opens up fire on innocent people with it, it means that I have failed as a dad. If your son, it's almost always boys, if your son as a juvenile has access to a weapon and opens fire with that weapon, it means that you as a parent or guardian have failed, because that kid shouldn't have had access to a weapon. And if you allowed that to occur, you failed, period. And I think parents and guardians need to start being held accountable for actions that their juveniles undertake. If you have a weapon in your home and a kid is able to take it and take it to school or take it to the mall or take it to a sporting event, you failed. You failed in your duties as a parent. And I think we have to start holding parents and guardians accountable here. I also think we have to have real conversations about where violent crime happens. The reality is this: black men, kids, starting at the age of 16 to about the age of 40, represent around 3 or 4% of the overall American population? That's probably about right. And they commit over half of all murders. Almost all of their murder victims are black as well. The only reason this is a story is because it happened at the Kansas City Chiefs parade. Over 180, I believe, people were murdered in Kansas City in 2023. You didn't hear about any of them because almost all the shootings happened between young black men, and almost all of their victims were young black men, and nobody talked about it. The only reason this is a story is because it happened at the Kansas City Chiefs parade. If these two guys had started firing at each other in some inner city street in Kansas City, none of you would have ever heard about it. Even the local Kansas City media probably wouldn't have covered it. The only reason this is a story is because it happened at the parade. And all the ESPN gun control people immediately came out and said, we have to have more gun control. Well, the reality is this. The guns is not the issue. The issue is somehow we're getting people who are committing multiple felonies to have the guns in the first place. And I bet that when you look at the data, whoever these guys were firing shots at each other, I guarantee you it wasn't the first time that the Kansas City police had ever heard of these guys. I bet they had arrested them before. I bet they knew that they were violent. I bet they knew that they were threats. The numbers out of D.C. are that if you are arrested for a murder, you had previously been arrested 11 times. I talked about this last week. Think about how hard it is to be arrested 11 times. I've never been arrested. I've never been in the back of a police cruiser potentially about to be arrested. By and large, I hope I'm never arrested for the rest of my life. Most of you have never been arrested. Most of you have never been in the back of a police cruiser. It's relatively hard to get arrested. Think about how many crimes you have to be committing to get arrested 11 times. And why in the world are you being let back out on the street again and 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 again before you kill somebody? We got to really, if we want to have a real conversation about violent crime in America, we have to talk about who does it, how to stop it, and why we don't seem to care unless violent crime is committed oftentimes by a white guy. Because that's the reality. If this had been a white shooter at Kansas City, we would have had 2 straight weeks talking about the white shooter. A couple of black guys shoot up a Kansas City Chiefs parade. It takes, a full week, basically, for their names even to come out. And we still don't know the full story here. Again, prosecute the kids as adults. If you're old enough to have a gun and open fire and hit 20 people, to the extent that that happened, the juveniles should be charged. And if you are able to be in a position where you are a parent or guardian and your minor child is possessions of firearms, I think often you should be charged with a crime as well because you have failed in your role as a parent or a guardian. I don't think we just have to hold kids responsible as adults. I think we have to hold adults responsible as adults. And I say that as a father of 3. If one of my minor children has a handgun and opens fire somewhere, I failed. Hope it never happens. God forbid it ever would. But if it did, I would have failed as a parent. I would have failed as a dad. And by the way, what you also see is almost all of these kids, sadly, don't have a father in their household. That's the real root cause. And I'm not taking shots at moms trying to do the jobs of both dads and moms, because inevitably when I talk about this, single parents email or they reach out to me and they say, Clay, what do you want me to do? I got a no good ex-husband. Got a no good guy, got me pregnant, bailed, and now I got to raise the kids on my own. Why are you blaming me? I'm not blaming you at all. Credit to you for trying to do the job of 2 parents. Men are failing boys in this country overwhelmingly. And I say that as a dad of 3 boys. Men are not doing their jobs. And you know what the data reflects? Young girls who are raised by single parents do far better than young boys who are raised by single moms. Not a lot of discussion about this. Why would that be? Well, the girls actually have a really strong role model. They've got a mom who's trying to do the job of a mom and a dad. They are less impacted by having only one parent home. Boys do awful, statistically, in one-parent households. Now, again, I'm not saying your son's going to do awful. I'm not saying you're doing anything wrong. Barack Obama and Bill Clinton were both raised by single moms, and they ended up president of the United States. There are exceptions to rules. I am not attacking you directly, okay? This is what happens on social media. You talk about large general trends, and people say, that's not me. Okay. Anecdotally, we can have success stories for single parents. Happens all the time. As a general rule, boys fail when dads are not in the home. And I see it now as a parent. If you're single and you're watching me right now and you don't have any kids, boy or girl, whatever you are, future mom, future dad, you don't know how much work having a kid is. I had no concept for what I was getting into 16 years ago when my first son was born. I had no idea how much work it was. People were like, what do you do in your free time, Clay? I raise kids. It's the reality. Especially when they're young, you don't have much free time. If you're doing a good job of being a parent. To do your jobs, then you raise your kids. You got limited amount of free time. I can't imagine having done it by myself. And I was a lot more lenient on people raising multiple kids until I had one myself. People say, what have you changed your mind on? What has parenting changed your mind on? One, if I had had one accidental kid, there's nothing that would have ever occurred that I would have had a second accidental kid. My own experience. Two, this is where having gone through raising kids and going and seeing the ultrasounds and seeing the babies born, I think a lot different about abortion now than I did before. That's why I'm a first trimester abortion guy. People get fired up at me. I still think abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, but I think it should only be legal by and large in the first few weeks of a pregnancy. Draw the line where you want it to be. Having gone through 3 pregnancies with my wife and seen 3 different babies, I think differently about life now than I did before. Before I had kids, I was like, I don't know. It's no big deal if you're a single parent. Having seen it, I'm like, my goodness, I don't know why anybody would try to raise any kid if they had a choice by themselves. And I certainly don't know how any parent, if you had one kid accidentally or one kid with a deadbeat dad, how in the world do you have another one? That's an experience that I've had that's changed my thought process in general.